All right. All right. Okay. So, so we're with Cat Code of Binary Tattoo, who has an engineering background and experience in mobile development and software architecture, and has become certified in data privacy law. And Cat now takes companies from privacy by design at the foundation level through data protection impact assessments up to full implementation of processes like handling user consent and incident response plans. So, Kat, what are the top 5 hurdles that you see today to implementing privacy by design in your interactions with companies?
Okay, so
That's a tough one,
the
huh?
number one hurdle is people don't really understand what privacy by design is. So privacy by design as a concept was introduced by Dr. Ann Cavoukian, and that's the way people often understand it. It's 7 principles, guiding principles, which are great. They include, like zero sum, no trade-off between privacy and security, and all of this wonderful stuff. But the problem is that that's all well and good as a concept. But when companies go to actually use it, they don't understand how to apply it to what they're doing.
Right.
So that would be hurdle number 1. Hurdle number 2 and 3 is, so first, your board of directors sees cybersecurity in general, including privacy, as a cost center. It's not a profit center. So it's always something that is going to require money. So that's always a hurdle to get the money to be able to do things properly. Because it's preventative, right? Anything preventative costs money. Yeah. And so the third hurdle is that it is expensive. So to do privacy by design properly will take resources, and that's both time and humans to implement it. So I always go back to these analogies of a home. Your privacy by design is the foundation of your house. And if you build a really strong foundation, you can continue to move your home up in different levels forever, and you'll be fine. If your privacy foundation is not good, or the foundation of your home is not good, then it collapses. The problem is you don't invite people over to your home and show off the foundation of your house. It's not the cool part of your house. And so the same thing applies when people make technical products. The cool part are the features and the service and the product, not the foundation. And so what I hear, especially from growing companies, is we don't have time to do that because we have to put our time into features. That's what our investors want to see. That's what our clients want to see. And then number 4 is that product designers don't understand privacy by design. So they're wanting to see cool things, and they don't understand the impact of that. So they're saying, hey, it'd be really cool is to put biometrics in, or it'd be really cool is to add this extra feature. But because they're sometimes not as technical, they often don't understand what the ramifications of that are. And the last one is the development teams not understanding it, but very specifically, a big hurdle right now is a lot of outsourced development teams. So the company is hiring an external dev team, which means even if the company cares about the privacy, the external dev team may not, and it's not on them, right? They're not being paid to do privacy. They're being paid to do the features you ask them for. And so it's very much a customer's always right kind of thing. And that dev team's like, well, I was asked to put in biometrics, so I put in biometrics, and no one's giving any pushback. So those are the 5 hurdles.
That is great, incredible. However, would you say that even say you have an internal development team, would you say that developers today are trained enough or aware enough of privacy by design, as developers?
No, I would say not. So people have a notion of privacy and what it means, but they don't really understand what it means to put in their product. And coming from an architectural side, that's really strategically where I like to look. And part of the problem with it is that the implementation is going to be completely different for every product and service. And so there are some concepts that are similar, like minimizing data and abstracting data. Like that's going to be similar, but what data can you minimize for your service and product? It's going to be different than other people's. What data can you abstract? So maybe your product and service, you need an age range for some reason. You could use an age range box, whereas another product or service requires your specific birth date for whatever it needs to do, and then it needs your birth date. So that's why you can't have a concrete checklist that says, okay, you know, only use this, only use this, only use this. It has to be by product and service. And so that education is really missing right now.
Right, right. Because it also sounds like it's a mix of a business decision and a technical decision, right? And so that's why I guess you were talking about maybe the product designer that often is involved with making those decisions. But it sounds like there should be there should be, I guess, ideally a dialogue between the product people and the development people who say, or maybe there is, I guess there should be development people who say, or the privacy. I guess I'm wondering what is missing in the process to make this, other than calling on someone like you, which of course, you know, a lot of companies will do, but for the companies, like, what would you like to see? What do you see as a possible solution? And I guess that in the development stages, to sort of make this questioning easier to integrate. I don't know if I'm
Yeah,
clear.
no, so, okay, so the primary thing, the number one for me is always minimization. That is the number one for me of all things. You minimize the data you're holding, you have less to protect, you have less risk, always minimize. So if you need to collect, let's say you need to collect a driver's license or some kind of ID in order to authorize someone or do authentication, great, collect it, delete it. Like the number of times I've seen people collect that kind of information and then just store it in a database. So it's always minimization. So I think the number one for me would be to have the product managers have that education first. If you look at Spotify, the music service, if you have not registered there, or you can go open the login, I like to use that one as an example, because right on there, they are collecting your gender and they're collecting your date of birth. So their algorithms clearly say, you know what, like all women born between 75 and 80 like this music, so I'm going to show them this. That's great. I appreciate why they need it, but it is not required information to sign up for their service. So what it should have is your name and email, which is required. And then it should have an optional gender, which is not. And then it should have some kind of, again, here's where you could abstract the birth date. Here's where you could take an age range. Were you born in the 70s? Were you born in the 80s? Were you born in the 90s? It doesn't have to be a specific date of birth. So they've massively increased their risk by including that date of birth and even the gender. And of course, now I like to use gender often as an example because it used to be a really easy way to de-identify information was to do gender. But now, because we have so many permutations on gender, and you could get a small subset of a group of people, and there might be only one non-binary individual in that group, now it's identifying information. So if product managers understood that better, or product designers, however you want to label them in your company, but if they understood that better, then when they had designed those fields, they wouldn't have put mandatory fields there. They would have said, hey, I need this, and I need you to ask if someone wants to contribute this information.
Right, right. Yeah, that's really interesting examples. What then could be done in terms of training of product managers if we look at that population? Like, I guess, what is the typical background of a product manager? That would they be from like more of a business background, or like what do you think is
yeah,
missing?
it really depends. Like I mean, I worked as a requirements manager at BlackBerry. I worked with product managers, and I work with product managers now at various companies. They do come from different backgrounds, and that is exactly the problem. You've got business development people, you've got marketing people in that role, you've got sometimes sales people in that role because they're trying to sell to the customers, and then they bring back the information and say, here's what our product needs.
Right.
And then sometimes you do get those very highly technical people in that role. So to me, it's two pieces, because there's I like to call it the design, even though development is a design, but the design of what the product should be, like that user experience.
Yeah.
And then secondary is the development of how you're going to implement it. So, I mean, in an ideal world, you would have a design that thinks, okay, what's the minimum that we need to gather? How are we making sure we're gathering consent for what we do need? How are we being transparent about what we're doing? That should be on whoever is designing that product. And then the developer's like, okay, here's the minimum information I have to have. Now, how can I best protect this information? How long do I need to keep it? How do I have to store it? Sometimes in small companies, it's the same person, right?
Right.
It's the same person making the app and designing the app, and all that whole cycle is the same person.
Right, right. Yeah, that sounds like and are you called in to do you ever do training to like large cohorts, or are you more involved in training like part of an organization, part of a large organization? If you do any training, what form does that take today? Or
Yeah,
could
so
it take?
it really depends on the size of the company. I do have a privacy by design course that I deliver.
Okay.
And I frequently deliver that with another woman who has extensive 30 years in privacy experience. And so, so she and I deliver the way we like to do it is an overview of regulations, because everyone needs to understand which regulations apply to them. And that goes by geographical region. It also goes by industry, right? So health regulations are often quite different than non-health related, or government versus like privacy versus public. So we like to do everyone to have that basic understanding. Then we do a focused presentation, like I said, for the people who are responsible for designing the projects, a focused one for the people who are designed on developing and implementing them. So from a more technology. So there's like the designers and the technologists. And then we also have a manual that explains all of this, because it's really key now for onboarding and ongoing, that you can refer back to, okay, what are the top 10 things I need to remember when I'm designing, or what are the top 10 things I need to remember when I'm implementing? And again, it can't be as concrete as make sure you divide your database tables, because not everyone can do that with their data. It should be, here's some suggested practices you might want to consider that might be helpful for your product or service.
Okay. But these training sessions, are they generally across organizations? Would you have people from different organizations
We
involved in your
could, I mean,
training?
again, like I do it all sorts of different ways, but to me, the key importance is that people are getting that education. So typically, I deliver it to a company will hire me in and say, we want to improve our privacy by design practices. Can you please come teach all of our employees how to do that?
Okay.
But certainly, like, it could be delivered as, so I like to tailor it to the product and service and say, for example, here's how you could leverage this. But it could absolutely, like, again, with Spotify examples, be explained on how that works. One of the other examples I always like to use is Equifax. So Equifax, one of the big reasons why they had their breach is because in order to sign in, they had user admin, password admin. And that's a great example where they traded off convenience for security. So they decided it would be easier for everyone to remember the password if everyone used the same login. But a privacy by design principle will tell you you need to have an audit record of who has logged in where and when, which means you should have every individual in that company should have had their own login, which is harder to do, but would have been a privacy first practice. And so that's a little more of an example of a policy that applies to privacy by design as opposed to a technical implementation. But then, you know, knowing on the flip side, again, the technical implementation is every time you log in, it's audited. So we know who accessed what record at what time. But that would have prevented that breach, because then somebody couldn't have tried admin and gotten into the system.
And just to be even more specific, say you're going to do a training for a company, like what sort of time investment are they looking at, or does it vary? I assume it can vary.
It varies. Like, again, I could do an overview in an hour. I like to do this, like I said, I like to answer questions. I like to have people specifically say, what about this with my product? And even if you get people from other companies, then they that might apply back to them, or they might have similar questions. So I like an hour would be better than nothing. That would be great. But I like to deliver this kind of like 90-minute intro, and then an hour specifically for the designers, an hour specifically for the technologists. It's not a lot of time to ask
Okay.
your teams to show up for 2.5 hours of live discussion and Q&A. And then again, having a manual to refer back to. I
Right.
find what's happening with privacy by design, like I said, everyone refers to Anne's high level strategic, which is great.
Yeah.
But what's missing is this practical, okay, but what about this for my app? And being able to say, okay, well, here's how you might want to look at handling that thing.
Right. And so that gets to my next question is actually, maybe it's something that you already mentioned, like the data minimization, but otherwise, is there an easy first step to privacy by design? Like when you try to, yeah, convince a company to, get started on this road, or what would be an easy first step?
Yeah, so a lot of the regulations are well, they all do. They call for some kind of data mapping. Even in your
Yeah.
privacy policy, you're supposed to be saying, here's the data that we collect from you. But it's I mean, surprising or not surprising, I guess surprising to me, but not surprising to the world. Very few companies have their data mapped. They don't actually know what data they're collecting. Or you'll say, are you collecting personal information? No, we're just collecting names and credit card numbers. And it's like, okay, well, that is personal information. So yeah, so the very first step would be to list your data and go from there. And then that's where you can then evaluate that data and say, do I need this? Do I not need this data? And then make sure, again, your privacy policy is up to date with the data that you are collecting. Because all of these things, the regulations, they seem like a real pain in the butt. That's not their purpose. They're not just things to jump through hoops. They're actually there to protect you. And if you follow those rules, you will minimize your risk. That's ultimately what they're trying to do, right? They're not.
Right. Have you ever considered like making some sort of online tool available for the data mapping? I don't know exactly what format it would be under, but just to get companies thinking and realizing, as you just said, that they are manipulating personal data. Have you ever used that as a way
Yeah,
to start the
there
conversation?
are lots. And I don't want to advocate any particular tool right now, but there are a lot of data discovery tools, and they range from free to tens of thousands of dollars a month, depending on the size of your company and the scope of what you want to uncover. Some of them will just run for a product. Some of them will run, I've seen really sophisticated ones that'll run through a company of 2,000 people and touch every endpoint. So it'll look at every single person's laptop, every server, and say, hey, did you know that this person has financial data on their laptop and they shouldn't because they're not in the financial department. So
Right.
that's your internal data you could be evaluating. From a product perspective, I've worked with fairly large, like fairly complex products and still managed to do it in an Excel spreadsheet. So there's never a reason why you can't start there. GDPR has what they call the record of processing activities, which is Article 30, or people just call it the ROPA. And it is a great template. You can download them from anywhere. I have my own, but certainly you can download them. And it's essentially, who are you taking data from? Whose data is it? What category is it? Like, is it a special category data? What are you doing with this data, and where are you storing it? And like even simple information to evaluate and say, like the administrator is giving in the data for the user. It is special category data, which makes it higher risk, and it's being stored in the US. So even just having that on a spreadsheet, then you can step back and say, okay, here's where our problems are.
Yeah. Do you think, I mean, these today are not supposed to be made public, right? They're private documents. They're not available. Do you think it would serve the cause to make them public, or no?
There's an element. So, okay, so this doesn't, I mean, your data map, technically, again, in your privacy policy, you have to be transparent about what you're collecting. So you do have to say whether you're even cookies have become a really big deal right now because everyone's put that like cookie acceptance on there. You have to say what data you're collecting from someone and what you're doing with it. So in that sense, it is public.
It is.
But what I've heard from companies that are trying to evaluate vendors is they're trying to bring in software, and they can't tell by reading the privacy policy whether people are lying or not. Like, right? So it's like, I want to use this software. Great example for the COVID pandemic is schools. So schools are trying to bring in new software to manage their students' data. And the privacy policy says it does certain things with the data, but it's very difficult to validate that.
Yeah.
And so that's part of the problem. I agree with you. I would love to see some kind of public validation. But even if you look at something like ISO for security or NIST for security, NIST has a privacy checklist. It's a checklist. So if I ask the average company, are you minimizing data? They could just say yes. It doesn't mean that they are, right? And so I think we're back again to people don't know what it means. So they can check yes on all the boxes and then put a badge or something on their website, but that doesn't mean they're actually doing it right. And so that's the problem. And I don't know on a grand scale how to validate people. How would you, other than paying a lot of money to a big consulting firm that's going to come in and put their stamp of approval on it. But that's not sustainable for small to medium business, doesn't have that option. So that becomes a problem.
Sounds like something that a society of IT professionals could, put their weight behind. Who knows? I mean, something they could help, bring to, make possible is that. And I guess the other option would be to imagine that a private vendor would sort of gain enough traction and make this information, I imagine, some sort of visual representation that might be more digestible than a privacy policy. And then that in the end, this sort of software vendor gains sort of the status of a benchmark or whatever, so serves as the sort of proof that a bit like Apple today is giving information, making more intelligible companies' privacy policies with respect to the use of data, that could be something that materializes down the line.
It would be great. And we often talk about, I mean, every time I'm in a panel learning, we often get to this. Data collection isn't just, it's not an engineering solution only. It's not a bunch of technology that fixes the problem. It's an engineering problem. It's a governance problem. How are you collecting the data? What is the data life cycle? How is that all working? It's an ethics problem about what risk are you putting people at by collecting this data and how are you using it? And then again, it's a policy problem because you have to figure out how are people accessing it and how are you trusting your teams to do what they're supposed to do with it? So like, this is, like you had kind of alluded to this at the beginning. It's like, who are the individuals that are responsible for this? And the problem is it's a lot of different people.
Too many.
It's a lot of different, it's not a physical thing anymore. It's not like if we had gold in a safe and then you could just say, well, the security person can just take it, put it in the safe and lock it. I mean, even that would have to have policies and processes around who's allowed to take it, who's allowed to open the safe. But this is bigger because it's like, once you've taken that gold, it's not gold, it's like toothpaste out of a tube. Once you've let the toothpaste out of the tube, you can't put it back in again. And that's fundamentally the problem with privacy. This is not like I lost something and can I have it back? So it's a much bigger, and a lot of it, I think people aren't considering the ethics, right? They're collecting data because they can. And that's a lot of what we're looking at with privacy.
Yeah, that's a big issue today. Let's see, what for you are the best case scenarios in your experience at succeeding at privacy by design? I guess, are there certain either, like, I guess, when are you most contacted? Is it because a certain sector like healthcare or finance really needs to get this right in general, like they're really under particular constraint? Is it because a company has had an issue, a problem, a breach, and then they come to see you? Like, what are the best case scenarios?
Typically the clients I get are looking to run privacy impact assessments. They're looking to run, which is great. And part of the privacy impact assessment is, have you applied all these engineering things? And so what happens out of that comes these recommendations that are privacy by design principles. The recommendations come out to say the access control isn't very good, or they could do a different kind of effort in storing how they store things. Part of the issue with some privacy impact assessments, especially some of the Canadian ones, come from the 10 principles of PIPEDA. And so there is an element in there that says safeguards, and it doesn't always go deep enough until how that data is, and there's a minimization of data, right? So the question is, have you minimized data? And then the other question is, are you safeguarding the data? The data protection impact assessment, which comes out of GDPR, I prefer to look more at that one because it's more in depth. So those are the questions I like to ask more about. How is the data accessed? Like, what is the actual controls you have to do data control? So sadly, I don't get a lot of people coming and saying, hey, we really want to do privacy by design. How do we do that? What I get is we need to run a privacy impact assessment. And then out of that, they go, oh, well, then how do we fix this? And then we say, okay, well, let's make sure everyone understands privacy by design so that going forward, you're not going to run into these problems again.
Right.
It's an afterthought. So my best case scenario would be new businesses. And I've said this before to you, especially if investors were able to say to a new company, we are not investing in you unless you make sure that you have a privacy first foundation in your product or service, then those teams would have the reason to put it in. And when their product is new, that is the best time to put in privacy by design because you're still designing the product. Once the products are established, and I get these companies that are bigger, scale-ups or enterprise companies, going back in to put privacy by design in is really hard. Again, you're going back in and redigging out the foundation of like a skyscraper is much more difficult than having someone come say, I've only done my foundation and I'm about to build my house. What should I do better? So it is much easier to implement at the onset.
And so when companies contact you to do these privacy impact assessments, who would that be? Would that be some sort of privacy officer? Would that be who would?
So often now what's happening is bigger companies are asking the vendors that they want to work with to fill out PIAs or to make sure PIAs are run. So especially now that everything's moving to tech, like I said, so to work with the school board, you often need a PIA. To work with any of the health networks, like anyone who has got a med tech app who wants to work with hospitals and they need a PIA. So, and then even smaller companies that are trying to work with bigger companies. Like if you had a product and you were trying to sell it to like Coca-Cola would probably say, hey, we need a PIA done here first. So those are the ones that are coming. Now, everyone probably should be doing this, but it's good at least to see, like I spent years trying to sell people on the fact that they needed to do it. And it's too hard again, because it's a cost center. Nobody wants to spend money on it. But now that they need to, for legal reasons or for business reasons, now they're coming back and saying, I can't get a job or I can't get a customer without it. Then they're doing it.
Right. And now that, we're hearing about all these breaches, it's also becoming costly not to implement, privacy and hence security. So there's still this big thing I'm having trouble getting my head around here, which is the role of IT, like security versus privacy. What is your, can you tell me more about how, an IT professional, my impression is that they're quite aware of security in general, but not so much about privacy. Whereas, as we saw, privacy can greatly enhance security. But I guess I'm trying to get my head around, are there any barriers to change that will come from a particular mindset? Like in security, the way security has been implemented so far, can that be a problem towards implementing privacy or not? I guess I don't know.
So they go together. So I always like to use the castle for security and privacy. So in your castle, your security is your moat, your wall, the people who stand on the top with your arrows, like on the battlements. So that is your security. If someone messes up and the cook leaves the back door open and someone sneaks in, there's a good chance you might be able to catch them and get them out and relock the door without damage. So security is making sure that you've protected your company assets, whether that is user data or company secrets or whatever it is. Security is keeping people out of those assets. Privacy is the fact that the king is upstairs with a map of his next plan of attack. If somebody sees the plan of attack, like again, toothpaste in a tube, you can't take that back. So once someone has seen the map, you're done. You can't reverse it. And so that's one of those, they're part and parcel. So security keeps the people out. And then privacy says, okay, now if someone does get in, how can we limit? So like encryption is an example that spans both. Like encryption is a privacy technique to hide data, to abstract data. So, right, so you can't see what that data is, it's hiding it. But at the same time, it's also a security technique because it keeps people out of your data. So like they're together, but privacy considers the actual keeping the asset from being seen or exposed, where security is just keeping people out entirely.
Yes. And what do you, I mean, is there, I guess I get the impression that there's a culture that is more geared towards thinking about security among IT professionals than privacy. Would you agree with that? Like, is there a specific mindset?
Yeah, so the IT for sure, because IT is very much focused on keeping your systems up and running, right? So even when I look at incident response, in an incident response, my first question is always, is your system down? Because if your system is down, the first, like if you have ransomware or something, the first and foremost from an IT perspective is getting that system back up again, getting moving to a different server, whatever. That is their focus. The privacy focus in a ransomware attack is, did someone access the data? What is the risk of harm to the individuals? So IT doesn't consider risk of harm, right? IT is looking at the risk to the company. And when you measure cybersecurity, I'm still struggling with risk on privacy because, again, it is so specific to the product and service that you have, the data you collect, and even the culture that you're collecting it from, because some data might be private in one country but not another. Like religion's a great example, where in Canada you could probably put that in a form and not care, but in other countries you can't just put in religion, that's secure data. So so privacy is very specific, where cybersecurity risk is measured by downtime, lost business, right? There's tons of formulas by which to measure cybersecurity risk. And it is very much about lost time, lost access, new customers you're missing coming in, existing customers who can't access. Privacy is really about what have you just done to your users, and not your cost, but what have you done to them? And that's a bit of a different mind frame. So like Ashley Madison, do you think the IT department cared that they were breached? I mean, they cared at the time that it was out, right? But the IT department doesn't really, once it's out, it's out. What is the IT department going to do? They're not going to run around and say, sorry, I let your name out. Like, once it's out.
Yeah, I guess it only matters if there's an impact for the company. If the company is fined for each person that has been basically breached, each person's data that has been made public, then, the company is impacted and it's measurable.
Yeah,
I guess.
And from a privacy perspective, you have to let your users know if they have to change passwords or do all that kind of stuff, because you want to make sure their data is protected, even on other services that they use. IT doesn't care about other services. Privacy does. So, and I'm not going to generalize. I mean, there are people in IT who do care about privacy, but just to say the way you're looking at it, like, what is the difference? Like, the initial role of cybersecurity in IT is to protect the system for availability and integrity, right? And make sure it's not compromised. Whereas privacy is making sure that data is not released, really.
Right. But so is there today, I know today companies are supposed to reveal when they've been breached, but are they fined? The idea that I was mentioning, where for every record that has been lost, made accessible, breached, are they fined?
They are. Like Equifax was fined in multiple ways by multiple different courts. They were fined actually by one of the courts in the US because they claimed they had a privacy and security program and it wasn't adequate. So they had lied on whatever adequacies they said they had for their security and safeguards. CCPA, which is the California legislation, will allow individuals to sue. The upcoming Bill 64 in Quebec currently also has something where, like, again, individuals could sue.
But is there a maximum amount?
Yeah, there's always a maximum. They always have a maximum that you could sue for. Now, in Canada, under some of the medical ones, you can seek damages, but not under PIPEDA. PIPEDA doesn't have. They can recommend fines. They can recommend that. It just doesn't have the legs, which is why they've proposed Bill C11. And C11 has much higher fines, and those fines would be awarded for breaches, but they would also be awarded when there is no privacy program in place. So, like, oops, we did everything we could. Look, in my house, I've got a security alarm. I locked every window and door. Someone broke in anyway. Okay, we'll cover your cybersecurity or your insurance. But if I leave the door open and there's a big sign that says, hey, I'm away on vacation, there's no insurance money for me. So it's the same thing with those fines. They will be like, you tried, everyone's going to get breached eventually, small fine, versus you didn't even try here. Your privacy program wasn't in place. You didn't even try and mitigate this. So massive fine. And that's the way GDPR has gone. If you look at every data protection authority kind of does the fines they feel like doing, they're all different. But if you actually pull that list of fines, you will see that the companies that got fined more money were the ones who didn't do due diligence. And the ones who tried to put privacy programs in place but got breached anyway, again, because it's kind of inevitable. But those companies were fined less because they had actually tried. So,
okay. But so today there's no immediate automatic consequence to a breach, basically. It's not like, so that's why I guess IT professionals do not necessarily feel as responsible,
right?
Because there's no automatic cost to the company of letting customer data out.
I'd say at this point it's reputational damage. So, and I hate to throw LastPass under the bus, but LastPass had a massive breach. And now anytime anyone asks me for recommendations on a password manager, it's the last name that pops into my head because they were breached, right? So whenever you hear that about a company, you kind of lose faith a little bit in the company. And I think that's where the bigger damage is coming right now, is in reputation. And people will say, well, that company doesn't care about privacy. So, or they didn't have the right security safeguards in place.
It does seem like, I sort of like the American option of being able to sue, because as we know, Americans are pretty good at, there's always going to be some lawyers who are going to help individuals sue and get awarded compensation. So it seems like that could be a good deterrent and a good reason for IT departments to become really more concerned and monitored on privacy than they are today, because so it sounds like, if I had a business to get into in the US, it would be that, to represent
people. CCPA actually has a piece in it where you can get like there are companies that can be a representative for privacy, so they are allowed to opt in and out on things on your behalf. And then when you use them, it makes sure that like when something isn't checked properly, then that tool looks and says, you're taking this data you're not supposed to take, and you said you weren't going to do this, and we've opted out of that. There's a lot of things CCPA got right. But the one thing for me is that it's so consumer focused. It's literally the California Consumer Privacy Act, and it is very much the don't resell my data. And so I know there's mix on the GDPR, and the GDPR is harder for innovation because it's limiting, but to me, it's the one thing that puts people first. And I really like GDPR for that reason. It's like, not what is going to make you the most money, but what is going to protect your customers the best, and then go from there.
Yeah, that's probably true. I mean, the intentions are there. From my limited knowledge of GDPR, it's that the implementation is still lacking in terms of really being efficient at protecting the end user, I guess, because as we saw these cookie acceptance, not policies, but mechanisms You know, we know they're not perfect today. Of course, I think they're making them better. They're improving them where they're saying you can't just get people to accept if they want to access the service, they really have to have the option. But
Right.
it seems like, you know, the intentions are good, but, you know, there's still a lag in terms of really being efficient.
Yeah, the adoption's not right. So I'm trying to, for my 2021, have an attitude of it's something is better than nothing. So people are claiming they're GDPR compliant and they're not, but
Yeah.
at least they're trying. So
Okay.
it's better out of 100 companies, if 80 of them claim they're GDPR compliant, that's better than nothing. And then if half of those companies are missing pieces, still better than nothing, right? Like at least they're trying. At least they're trying to update their privacy policy. At least they're trying to look at some of the things they can do for data. Even the
Right.
fact that users are now able to request their data and companies have to figure out where the data is to grab it is forcing them to actually examine their systems and say, where are we even keeping this stuff? So yeah, so I'm like, I was in the, oh my God, this isn't done right. But now I'm like, it's like being a parent when your kid tries to bake something on their own for the first time and the kitchen's a disaster and you're
Yes.
looking at it and then you're like, at least they did it on their own. So that's where I am right now. The kitchen's a mess and the cookies are missing ingredients, but at least they did it on their own, and that's the first step towards independence. So we'll go with that. The companies are trying; they're trying to get it right. They're hiring in privacy officers. There are less people in this world who are experienced in privacy than there are jobs. So that's a fundamental problem.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, it's better than nothing.
Have you heard of groups, or have you thought of, say, we're only focused on Canada for now, you know,
Yeah.
to for once not always talk about the US or Europe, to have this sort of, you know, how you have the best companies to work for, the most privacy compliant, or maybe privacy and security, sort of a
Ooh.
ranking. Have you thought of, or
I mean,
have you
that would
seen
be
people
great.
do
I
that?
just don't know how you would do it. I think I don't know how you would actually, I don't know how you would actually, again, establish that without handing over a checklist that people claim they're doing things when they're not.
I guess,
So
I
you need
guess,
certified auditors like that. In
yeah.
security, basically what it's come down to is companies do their own ISO and NIST checklists, and then you hire a certified auditor, and that certified auditor will come in and say, no, you're actually not doing this well enough. You would need certified auditors in privacy, which is basically the regulators. But again, there isn't enough people to do that.
So you're saying just taking, for example, just staying at the level of their privacy policies, or, you know, whatever is visible would
Yeah.
not be enough for you? That would be
Because
insufficient.
it's a statement. It doesn't
Yeah.
unfortunately mean anything. And too many times I've seen people cut and paste privacy policies from one website to another without
Right.
even thinking about it. Um,
Right. Right.
so even so, Shopify, if you launch a store on Shopify, it provides a privacy policy for you where you're supposed to fill things in. And sometimes when I buy things that I know are from a Shopify powered site, I click on the privacy policy just to see. And I've
Yeah.
encountered more than one where it says, we collect square bracket, insert your data here, square bracket. So that's the issue.
Right.
Like these privacy policies are not, they're not
Right.
the do as you say and say as you do. They're just
Yeah.
grab one from somebody else that's already GDPR. I've seen that. I've seen other startups say to each other, hey, just go on a European company because you know they'll have it right. Grab someone
Yeah.
else's policy and change the name. And
Right. Right.
that's just
Right.
not the way it works.
Right. Right. But yeah, I agree with you. It's probably complicated to really do well, but it sounds like in a way, isn't that what Apple has started doing for apps, where it's just looking whatever is declared by apps, and just at least even that is problematic. Like, I guess someone was commenting in a New York Times article on the Spotify policy, and saying that they really collect a lot more data than they really need to, but they're saying it. So just
Yeah,
making that accessible to
that's
people.
that I've heard a lot of lawyers complain about that too, that people are using consent as a magic bullet, that by saying, look, I need 3 pieces of data, but I'm collecting 10. So if I list all 10 of them in my privacy policy and you agree to that privacy policy when you sign on to my service, then you're letting me take the data. And so again, that's where GDPR kind of really says, like, you have to have legal basis. You have to have a reason to take the data. And I'm hoping that Canada has that as well. But it's not as clear. And so sometimes people are like, I need the birth date because I'm doing statistical information. That's a legal reason. And it's like, no, that's a reason that you would like to have the data, but it's not actually necessary to your product or service. That's just a nice to have for you. And so I think education around that distinction between what do you actually require to run the product versus what is a piece of data you're collecting additionally for those. That's what I was saying when the sign-ons, those should be optional, and they're not right now, right?
Yeah. Right. No, I'm just trying to find solutions here.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that's good. I guess I don't know if I need to ask you. I guess yeah. So I'm going to look into that tool that you sent me a link to. That tool to help Canadian businesses understand GDPR, that sort of report that was put out, to see what I can help extract from that and make it even more accessible and intelligible, in terms of some sort of online format, either a quiz or a step-by-step format, but looking into that. So so thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I hope I can, and if you have any people that that might be interested in participating in these interviews of IT professionals or product designers who are, to help me work on this proposal if it is approved, of course. That would be helpful. I guess one last question might be, would you have any suggestions on how to narrow the focus of a tool that helps SMEs? Would you narrow it by industry, narrow it down by industry, narrow it down by size of company, or by, you were saying, I knew you were talking about the sensitivity of data like healthcare, but it seems like, I don't know if it's a good idea to go into the more sensitive areas, because my impression is that they would already be quite aware of these issues. Or
You'd be
if
surprised. Like financial has their own regulations and health has their own, but you'd be surprised the way people collect health information and don't handle it properly. So yeah, verticals are interesting, but I think the company size really matters, because a small company has pros and cons. Like I said, the pros are certainly that they can more easily change their product and service because it's small, and they don't have the silos for processes. So that's great. But the con to a small company is they also don't have the time and resources to get stuff right. So yeah, like it's the way that cyber people often put it is the maturity model, and I think that's the way to do it. So depending on your cyber or privacy posture or maturity model, would be to say, in a small company, from a privacy perspective, you would be doing these things, and then to become more mature, you would do these, and then to hit like like you understand the data you collect, versus you've gone through it and minimized it, versus you have optimized it. You know what I mean? Like, just to I think that
sort of like, so you would be like certified level 1 privacy by design, level 2, level 3. And often you're saying that it might go with the size of your company, or not necessarily?
I think that it should go with the size of your company, because as you grow, you should have more maturity in this area, but they don't always. But even still, it's like, hey, look, you're a startup. This is what we expect of you versus like you're a growing scale. You should have at least, but I don't know. You're right. I would argue because it doesn't matter what size your company is. You should be regulation compliant if you're collecting data, if you're 10 people or 1,000 people. So yeah, it would be more of it's the maturity models where you are in that. Have you started your privacy journey? Have you, like I haven't started yet. I've started, but I don't know where to go, or I want to start, but I don't know where to go. And then I need to optimize.
Right, right. And you are able to come in at any of those points, right? Correct.
Yeah, so when I run a compliance assessment for companies to tell them where they stand for global regulations, and that's essentially the maturity model I use. Is I say you have not met compliance, you've met compliance, and then you've optimized compliance, because the actual regulation that says you've done this, you could check box, but there are ways to do it better, right? So that's the way I do my maturity model: is haven't met, and then optimized.
Okay, that sounds